I tried to review the book a little bit today. I didn't get very far, and then I just clicked on like a speech that he did, that Miguel Chris did, and I just to kind of jog my memory of everything that's in the book. I mean, there's so much stuff in there. So yeah, I feel like I've refreshed my memory a bit. So I feel like I'm basically ready.
Cool.
Yeah, I guess I can introduce it. So hello, I'm Chris Guida. Um, I uh, I'm on the Multiversity Project podcast. Um, and yeah, I'm with Connor Dykes, and today we're going to talk about a book by Ian McGilchrist called "The Master and His Emissary," and it's about, in brief, it's about the right hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the human brain. But
Right and left hemisphere.
what did I say?
Two rights. That's just what we need. There's
That
two.
must be me. Yeah, that must be that must be my left hemisphere dominance right there. Yeah. So yeah, sorry. So the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere of the human brain. But it turns out that that touches on basically everything else. I mean, it touches on psychology, it touches on philosophy, it touches on, uh, what's it called? Like biological history,
Mhm.
evolutionary
Yeah, he goes into that a little bit.
history.
That's one of the things I'm most interested in. Um, One of the things that really stuck out to me that I feel like gets overlooked a bit is that each hemisphere can, in theory, function in complete isolation because they have all the same characteristics. It's just that they do them in a different way. So it's like he emphasizes a lot throughout the book. It's how they do the processes versus what processes or functions are done. Um, and they purposefully work as kind of opponent processors. He mentions, even though he doesn't use that word, I think you could make that argument that
Yeah, no, exactly. Actually, that was one of the six things that I wrote down for today is
nice.
opponent processing. Um, yeah. So I think that McGilchrist takes a very right hemisphere sort of supremacy view, where he thinks that although, as you said, the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere can operate independently, his position is kind of that the left hemisphere is very dependent on the right brain, whereas the right brain could probably function by itself pretty well.
Yeah, I
So
don't know if you would argue that.
he's a right hemisphereist.
Yeah, he would definitely say it's dominant. I mean, it's in the title for one, and I mean, the small story he gives is Nietzsche's little tale of a master who sent his emissary out throughout the land because he can't do everything himself, and the left hemisphere is very specialized for particular tasks. But then the emissary eventually starts claiming to be the master in all these different areas, which you can correlate to different areas of one's life, even though it doesn't have that big picture view, and eventually, tries to suppress the master that originated the ideas in the first place because the left hemisphere, in some sense, doesn't understand the right hemisphere. That's one of the key differences he tries to argue is that the right hemisphere understands the function and purpose of the left hemisphere, but the left hemisphere sees the right hemisphere as this shadowy presence, like this other that it views either as irrelevant or like a threat, and therefore the right hemisphere should, in some sense, be in charge because it understands what they both need to do. Even though I don't know that he'd make the argument that the right hemisphere on its own can function, like it does need the left hemisphere for specialized tasks, which it's very good at.
Right. Yeah. Um, yeah, I think you put that very well. Yeah, I just had like 10 thoughts all at once. So the story of the master and his emissary is how he likes to visualize the right and left hemisphere, where the left hemisphere is the emissary, and it sort of, as you said, it sees the right hemisphere as this threat or as irrelevant, and so it tries to take over all of the work, all the power for
Mm-hmm.
itself. And McGilchrist talks about how there are lots of sort of mental illnesses that are related to when the left hemisphere does this, and it becomes too dominant. And he, so as you said, yeah. So the left hemisphere can do some things that the right hemisphere can't really do, and the right hemisphere can do some things that the left hemisphere can't really do. He talks about how even in animals like birds and monkeys and things like that, there is this division. Although the division isn't as
No.
stark, like it's not as big of a division. But he says that I remember he said that birds, when
Yeah.
they want to focus in on their prey, for instance, they would use their right eye because that's connected to the left hemisphere. And the left eye, which is connected to the right hemisphere, has this kind of more diffuse and general awareness, almost like it's looking out for potential predators. And I think Jordan Peterson even said this in his conversation with Ian McGilchrist,
Yeah.
where he talks about how the left hemisphere is specialized for being a predator and looking for prey, and the right hemisphere is specialized for being prey and looking for predators.
Yeah. Although he also said that the bird uses its left eye, right hemisphere to interact with other birds. So it's also for social interaction as well. Whereas the left hemisphere is like he connects it also more recently to like very autistic behavior where it doesn't understand social cues and so on or context. The bird,
Right. So you said the right hemisphere is for social interaction, correct?
yeah, in addition to watching out for potential threats, Vervaeke also describes it as the left hemisphere works on well-defined problems, and that would require precision. It dislikes ambiguity, so that would be like gathering seeds or something. Like the bird would look at the seed, or in humans, it's used for tool use, even hunting. Um, Whereas the right hemisphere would work on ill-defined problems, evolved probably for novelty and, like you said, avoiding predation, as Jordan Peterson said. And it's more comfortable with that ambiguity, like that's what it works in, and is good at getting the overall gestalt of something rather than the individual features. Like I think you could connect it to the example Vervaeke brings up of like a bush moves, and the animal could either assume it's the wind or a tiger, and the the right hemisphere would be able to imagine just like a very brief flash that it could be a tiger, and therefore it should just get out of there. Like it's comfortable with fuzzy ideas that um, are very detailed if you drill down into them with the left hemisphere, but it doesn't need to. Like it can act on those, whereas the left hemisphere is slower in that regard because it needs to precisely get to the features.
Right. Yeah. It seems like so I've always, even before I read this book and I started thinking about the different functions of the left and right hemispheres, um, I I noticed that there were sort of complementary functions that my mind had. I used to be pretty into the Myers-Briggs typology stuff, and I remember if you look at the cognitive functions, there's 8 cognitive functions, and for an INTP, which is what I was at the time, possibly still, uh, the primary function is introverted thinking, and the secondary function is extroverted intuition. And I remember thinking, okay, so one of these is kind of a more convergent way of thinking. Um, so introverted thinking is this kind of like you're processing things at this very like you're kind of being like sequential, like you're
Yep.
following a logical chain, from A to B. And the extroverted intuition side seems more like divergent thinking or more right brain thinking to me, where you're almost you're trying to come up with new ideas. You're trying to, I guess you're trying to,
See connections also.
yeah, you're trying to look at the, yeah, as you said, the gestalt and not the features. And so you're trying to come up with a new gestalt. And so that's what uh, I guess the right brain is always sort of searching for ways that the current gestalt is deficient and ways that a new way of looking at things might fit reality better.
Yeah, and being aware of new potential gestalts, whereas the left hemisphere works with what you already have modeled. Like it represents, it doesn't originate anything. He argues quite often that it just deals with the raw information that the right hemisphere presences, and then it represents it in its own schemas, like very very model-esque schemas rather than having direct contact with reality that the right hemisphere does.
Right. Yeah. He does have this kind of like chain
Yeah.
of information flow that's directional. So what he says is that so you have reality out there somewhere, and then you have the right brain hemispheres. The right brain interfaces with reality directly, and basically filters out information from reality. So it interfaces with reality by saying no. Basically, it has to only accept a small fraction of the information that comes
Right.
in.
The combinatorial explosion, as Vervaeke calls it.
Yes, exactly, the combinatorial explosion. And then he says that the left hemisphere does something similar with the information coming from the right hemisphere that the right hemisphere does with reality itself. And so the right hemisphere is, as you said, like presencing all of this information and sort of broadcasting it over to the left hemisphere. But the left hemisphere can't make sense of all of it, and so it just selects the bits that it can sort of that fit into its predetermined model, and basically ignores the rest.
Yeah, and then it breaks them down in a way that it can create a more efficient model, which it then gives back to the right hemisphere to create like a new gestalt that is much more like efficient to do tasks, in the sense that like I think you could make the argument that using Vervaeke's language, the right hemisphere is specialized in gestalts, and then also the being mode, whereas the left hemisphere specializes in features, going down to features, and then the having mode, which is somewhat related. I also wanted to bring up though with MBTI, I was also obsessed with it for a while, and I'm INTP as well. And I think you could almost make the argument that all of so thinking is definitely left hemisphere. I think based on how much McGilchrist gives to the right hemisphere to do relatively, you could almost argue that sensing, feeling, and intuition are all kind of specialized in the right hemisphere, and yet we have like an overproduction of just the left hemisphere thinking mode in a lot of society today.
Yeah. I guess it was who was talking. Was it somebody was saying that? Oh, did you ever read Prometheus Rising by Robert Anton Wilson?
No, but I watched your guys' video on the
Okay, yeah,
Wilson's stage.
yeah. We did at least two, maybe three. I think we did 3 episodes on that book. It's a really good book, and it talks about like there's 8 what they call cognitive circuits, but it kind of roughly maps to sort of the MBTI functions. Maybe not like an 8 to 8 mapping, but like maybe like a 4 to 8 mapping. Anyway, so there's the lower circuits and then there's the higher circuits. The lower circuits have to do with sensing and thinking and semantics and well, so there's again, and morality. And then 5 through 8, the higher circuits are all sort of these intuitive circuits. And I think what Wilson said, if I recall correctly, is that the lower 4 functions are associated with the left hemisphere, and the higher 4 functions are associated with intuition. And so, yeah. Anyway,
well, I mean,
that with what you were saying,
and map those to the 8 cognitive functions of MBTI now, because that seems like ripe ground. I wasn't aware of the first 4 being left hemisphere and second for right hemisphere either. That's interesting.
Right. Yeah. And the higher 4 circuits in Robert Anton Wilson's model, which are actually Timothy Leary's model, but just slightly different.
Yeah.
Are associated with spirituality too. And so I guess that kind of jives with McGilchrist's model as well.
Oh yeah.
Although McGilchrist wouldn't say it's his model. I mean, he really does like go through all of the neurological like studies that have ever been done.
It's extremely thorough. I was continuously impressed with like the repetition in a very just helpful way for his arguments. Of like the studies that really stood out were the ones who had I believe it was a stroke, and then the left half of their body was not recognized. So the left half is controlled by the right hemisphere. It was not recognized by their conscious ego, which I think you could also argue is the left hemisphere, because it kind of represents itself to itself, whereas the right hemisphere is much more diffuse and like the unconscious. And they would not see the left half of their body as belonging to themselves. Like, you remember, they would say, "Oh, this isn't my arm," even though they would like move it, and then they'd like want to get rid of it even, and see it as something completely alien. So I think that's a very visceral representation when there is the lack of the corpus callosum connecting the two hemispheres of how the left hemisphere sees the right.
Yeah. Actually, in light of that, uh, maybe I'll change a little bit what I said earlier about how the higher circuits of Wilson's model are connected to all connected to the right hemisphere. There's one circuit that Wilson calls the meta programmer, which sounds a lot like what you were saying about how the left hemisphere represents itself to itself.
That's true.
Yeah. Do you remember that circuit where it's kind of like infinite hall of mirrors type thing?
Yeah, actually, that reminds me of it's kind of an obscure part of the book, but he was talking about in the Reformation, I believe, there was this like, I mean, I guess he was critical of this sort of thing, but it can be, I do think it can be useful, like in mindfulness, where there was a picture of some chapel or something, and then within that picture there was another picture, and it just kept going infinitely. And he argues that that kind of infinite regress of self-representation is indicative of the left hemisphere's, I mean, he might have even called it like narcissism, not in the sense that it's yeah, I guess it's just how it functions. Like, it only knows itself, so it needs the right hemisphere to bring it into contact with direct reality.
Right. Yeah. Which is so interesting because, of course, McGilchrist posits the existence of external reality. Have you ever read Gödel Escher Bach by Douglas Hofstadter?
No, I've heard excellent things about it though.
Oh man, yeah, you should definitely read that. So it's a very so it basically proves some mathematical ideas and applies them to reality. So Gödel's theorem is have you heard of Gödel's incompleteness theorem?
Yep.
Yeah. So it's a big idea, but to try and fit it into as few words as I can, it's the idea that a formal system cannot know itself. So if you have a formal system of logic, the more what is it? The more coherent it is, the less complete it is.
Yeah.
and vice versa. And you can prove this mathematically. And Hofstadter does a great job of explaining it. But it's almost like McGilchrist really is coming from a kind of more right hemisphere view of things, because there's even a part in the book where he's like, well, of course external reality exists, of course what are we experiencing then if we're not experiencing external reality? And he says, and the right hemisphere is better than the left brain because it knows this. But it's almost like I remember thinking like, well, you're just kind of assuming that to be true. I mean, that's a very right hemisphere way of looking at things. But the left hemisphere is the only part of the brain that would say, is the only hemisphere that would say, well, maybe there is no external reality. Maybe I'm the only thing that exists. And so McGilchrist says, well, that's so ridiculous. Of course, the left hemisphere is just making stuff up. And of course, the left hemisphere is being ridiculous. And that's why it's inferior.
Yeah, actually, that's a good point. He does bring up, like, it was almost begrudgingly. It's hilarious to see him kind of grill the left hemisphere for all its issues throughout history. Like, it's kind of almost like a brutal takedown of its overemphasis, which I enjoyed. But there are obviously things it's good at, and he acknowledges that one thing is unintuitive, like bizarre, abstract hypotheses that may not fit with our right hemisphere intuitions that we evolved to interact with the world with. And I do think that likely led to a lot of developments of science, like the heliocentric model. That I don't think that would have ever been developed if it wasn't for the left hemisphere's very precise refusal to give into what feels what seems intuitively right, and just look for very odd things. Like it just follows the logic very repetitively, but it's good at that.
Yeah, exactly. He denigrates the left hemisphere for being so good at distancing itself from reality and abstracting from reality. But of course, this is exactly what it's good at and exactly what it's useful for.
Yeah,
So
which he
yeah, I would definitely agree
acknowledges.
with that.
But yeah, and somewhat related, like even though you wouldn't think it's that applicable to art, I feel like you could make the case that Alice in Wonderland has a lot of that left hemisphere bizarre, what would we say, like almost uncanniness. He does connect the left hemisphere to like when it's over relied on, then things become uncanny. Like he connects that, I think, to schizophrenia as well. But like Lewis Carroll was, the mathematician Charles Dodgson, he seemed extremely left hemisphere. If you read about him and the abstract things within Alice in Wonderland, even though they seem very dreamlike and so on, they're unintuitive in a sense that I think maps somewhat to what he's talking about with the left hemisphere coming up with abstract theories, just utterly divorced from reality in that sense, which I think actually can have artistic merit for like completely distancing yourself from this world in order to better appreciate the contrast. When you return to it after a work of art.
Yeah. So I definitely wanted to talk about art and how so he basically McGilchrist uses art as a an example of something that the right hemisphere does a lot better than the left hemisphere, where basically the art, like basically once you break it down and put it into words or logic, it kind of kills it, right? It kind of he he presents art as this thing that's kind of alive, and he says that the right hemisphere is much more skilled at connecting to things that are alive and
Yes.
things that are evolving kind of organically. And the left hemisphere likes to see things as these static kind of snapshots.
Yep.
And so he says that art and music are kind of like life forms almost. And this is actually a really cool thing. He talks about saber and conoser. I don't remember what the Latin version of that is or the French version. I think he talks about the French version. But I've been learning Spanish for the last, well, ever. But I've been living in Mexico full time for the last few years, and so I've been learning Spanish a lot. And I thought it was interesting how there's two different words for to know, one of which is conocer and one of which is saber. And conocer is to know, like it's almost like to meet, right? Like to have you experienced it firsthand. When you say like conociste a ese lugar, like have you been to that place? But it's not like a fact that you can know. It's like a being that you can know, like an entity,
So if you
almost like
had
a form of consciousness.
right, so if you're describing a different location and you hadn't been there yourself, you wouldn't use that word, connoisseur.
Sorry, if you're what?
If you're describing a location and you hadn't been there in person, you wouldn't use the connoisseur.
Um, well, you would still use it, but you would say no conocí a ese lugar. Like I haven't been
Okay,
there.
okay.
Um, so saber is more like, do you know what 2 + 2 is? Like, do you know who the president is? Do you know what the capital of Texas is? you know,
Yeah,
like facts.
that makes sense.
I'm still actually working out the nuances. It's not at all clear cut, and there are times where I hear people kind of interchange them at moments where it seems like that should be inappropriate. But yeah,
That
it's kind of
definitely,
yeah.
I think, would map, it sounds like, with the direct experience. And what you said about things being in flux, that the right hemisphere can still perceive them as constant. Like he talks about rivers or even people or constantly changing over time. Um, the left hemisphere isn't able to, like on its own, is not able to continuously see them as a permanent entity over time. Like it's like you said, it's that ancient Greek early starts with a Z. type of film where it's the papers spinning and you just see like very fast snapshots, kind of like the flip book things that kids will do. Um,
Right.
and then that can lead to like the imposter syndrome, where like in the elderly, if they have a stroke, a right hemisphere stroke, they may not even recognize their own spouse because only their left hemisphere is working, and they think they are imposters because they only remember their model of them, and it's not exactly the same anymore.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. That's really interesting. How and I think that goes to what you were speaking about earlier with the uncanny valley thing, where something looks like something else that you know, but you don't get that like
Yes,
spark of recognition.
exactly.
And so the spark of recognition comes from the right hemisphere, I guess,
Yep,
and whereas the model of the thing comes from the left hemisphere.
yep.
Um,
And I do think this has implications for like modern culture, like a lot of the critiques of I don't know if you're familiar with them, but there's those like red letter media Star Wars prequel reviews that just utterly deconstructed them, as I thought as kind of paradigmatic of the left hemisphere possession is the term I use, where
I'm not familiar.
like
Can you give
very
me a little
um,
summary?
yeah,
So
just
they break down the prequels.
yeah, like extremely narrow, like critical, very literalizing, like sarcastic, detached, and kind of mocking in a sense, versus trying to immerse oneself in a different like artistic reality to imagine how it would be to be there, but rather being
Right,
detached.
exactly.
I think you can connect it also to like postmodernism's obsession with language over direct reality.
Yeah, yeah. I was just thinking as you were saying that, oh, look at these reviews of the prequels. They're criticizing them, right? They're deconstructing them.
Yeah.
So I mean, you can. This is something that the left hemisphere is very good at. It's very good at taking something that's alive and just describing it in words, and thereby killing it, thereby just making it seem silly or
Yep.
uh, yeah, just depriving it of the magic. And so this is of course what postmodernism does, what deconstructionism does, and what critical theory does. And
Yep.
actually the name critical theory should give you an indication of which hemisphere is responsible for that. I mean, you really can just take any truth about external reality and just flip it on its head and make it false. You know, basically just twist it around and put it into some context that it's not really supposed to be in, and thereby falsify it.
Yeah. And then at the same time, though, I feel like the right hemisphere is the one that understands context best, whereas the left hemisphere kind of operates from a vacuum mentality of like, is this true just point blank rather than is it true within this context? And so, in some sense, I feel like there's almost a collective transition of that sequence of right hemisphere, left hemisphere, back to the right hemisphere that like civilization is going through. And with postmodernism and so on, you could view that as the left hemisphere breaking things down. And and I guess you could say using the right hemisphere to acknowledge how things are untrue in certain contexts to deconstruct those as well. Whereas we still haven't, started to collectively make the shift toward a new gestalt, like a new meta narrative mythos, which the right hemisphere is good at. And I feel like because there's that lack, people are kind of grasping for very salient gestalts like conspiracy theories or going back to fundamentalist religions, because those do give the right hemisphere some gestalt to hold on to that feels meaningful, even though it hasn't properly gone through that deconstruction process of the collective left hemisphere of science or even the valid aspects of the critiques of postmodernism. Like there's still kind of the new emerging gestalt that has to be built in a sense, whereas people, I feel like in some sense, are impatient and kind of go for smaller, very attractive gestalts, like I said, like conspiracy theories or going back to fundamentalist old religions and so on, or traditions.
Right. Yeah. When you when your gestalt is broken, then I guess the left I guess the right hemisphere goes out and tries to imagine new gestalts, and I guess the left hemisphere is, as you were saying earlier, is much less comfortable with not having a gestalt. Like if there isn't a gestalt, the left hemisphere just shoehorns whatever's there, because it can't really operate without a Gestalt. It needs a Gestalt so that it can make sense of what it's looking at. Whereas the right hemisphere is kind of comfortable just being like, we'll figure it out. Well, it operates in kind of multiple Gestalts, kind of layered on, kind of superimposed, I would say. What I was going to say so I kind of used to be a postmodernist, and you were talking about like how does society like get past postmodernism. I feel like I've done this. Back in college, I remember kind of figuring out, everything can be false, and so nothing is true. And so I remember thinking things like the sky is blue. Well, obviously sometimes the sky is not blue. Sometimes the sky is gray. Sometimes if you went to a different planet, it would have a different color sky and things like that. And so I'm not sure if I think that's the left hemisphere just kind of playing with words in a I'm not trying to say like it's being too enthusiastic with the power of words.
Yeah, it definitely takes words as reality too much. Whereas I really liked how McGilchrist delves into the origins of basically all words as originally being metaphors for, physical reality in the body, which Vervaeke is really good at talking about as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. The whole throw thing.
Yeah, exactly. And the left hemisphere also, I feel like, sees things in very black and white. Like it's almost like the computer, like zeros or ones, like the dichotomy aspect, whereas the right hemisphere understands the reality of gradients and continuums. And so I feel like once you realize, well, the sky is not always blue, then if someone doesn't have the right hemisphere, developed as part of they're not comfortable having a proper integration, then the left hemisphere would just like kind of get anxious and say, okay, well, is it blue or is it not blue? Like I have to choose one in that sense.
Right. Yeah. It kind of reminds me of the difference between INTPs and INTJs, where supposedly, so the P and the J are perceiving and judging, and the P, an INTP is supposed to be more open with ambiguity, more comfortable with ambiguity and uncertainty. And INTJs like certainty; they like things to be black and white, things like that. I don't know if that's just me being a MBTI nut that's also an INTP.
No, I think that's true. I always view it as the P's prefer to wait longer to have more information to decide. So they like being in the liminal zone of still being able to make a decision when the time comes, whereas J's like to make a decision ahead of time and then start planning based on that model. And I think those also work as opponent processors as well, because you can never have perfect information, like as Jordan Peterson says, but more is better, and you don't want to rush things with a poor model either. So yeah, I'm very much a perceiver as well in that sense.
Cool. Yeah. I do think that this idea of opponent processing is one of the most important ideas I've ever heard, and Vervaeke, of course, is basically where I heard that from in his Awakening from the Meaning Series Crisis. And McGilchrist doesn't say that I don't think he uses the term opponent processing, but he very strongly suggests that the left hemisphere and right hemisphere are opponents in this opponent process, because the corpus callosum, right,
Yep.
is what it's called. The corpus callosum, which is the very small bridge of brain tissue that bridge the left and right hemispheres, is the activity in that corpus callosum is mostly inhibitory, is what McGilchrist says. And so basically, in as much as the left and right hemispheres are communicating with each other, they're mostly telling each other no. They're mostly saying, no, don't do that. So it's kind of like, and he actually, McGilchrist has this beautiful image of what's happening, where, what was it? Like you're trying to point your finger at something, or you're trying to write something. Oh, what was it? Oh man, I'm gonna have to go look at what it was. But anyway,
I use something sort of similar. I don't know if it's the one you use, but like when I'm trying to open or close a door extremely quietly to like not wake someone up, then I kind of press on both sides and then turn the handle in a way where it's like I'm using pressure on both sides at the same time to make the most precise motion possible. I feel like it was similar. His example was similar to that.
Yes, exactly. It was, man, yeah, I'm gonna have to go look up what it was, but it was like, how do you make a very precise movement with your finger? You know, say you're like a surgeon or something like
Yeah,
that. What you can do is you can actually press, you know, you can press against your hand, so you can be moving this hand in this direction, and you can be pushing with this hand in this direction, and so then the movements can be much more precise.
exactly.
Yeah, and I was like, that's so beautiful. I mean, that's got to be what's happening, because that is the most precise way to go about the world.
Yeah, and I feel like you said in the conversation with Vervaeke, ideally the political parties should also be doing that as well. Whereas now I feel like just due to the information, the media landscape changing so much, among other things, it's almost like the representation of both of them has become so black and white, the left hemisphere style, where they just are antagonistic as opposed to um, the opponent processors that self-correct each other's excesses and each other's own specialty.
Right, exactly. I mean, yeah. So I think you're referring to our romanticism conversation with John Vervaeke, where we talked about we talked a little bit about like masculinity and femininity in there. And I'd love to hear if you think that connects to the left and right hemispheres, and in what way. But we'll hit that in a minute. But yeah, so then we connected it to the political parties, and how basically Team Red and Team Blue are supposed to be like opponent processors. Ideally, they're supposed to be opponent processors. They're
Yeah.
supposed to be working towards the same goal. And we talked about in that episode how it seems like they're no longer doing that. It seems like they're trying to destroy each other instead of simply trying to correct each other. And so I don't actually know if that's the case. I think it might just look that way because of the information landscape and how crazy everything is with just the internet. Like the internet is much crazier than real life. Like if you talk to people and just have normal conversations face to face with people, they're not nearly as crazy as people on the internet seem. And there's a lot of reasons why that might be, but like I'm not as pessimistic as a lot of people about that. Like I think maybe it is still an opponent process. It's just
Oh yeah, the core of it is still there. It's just like you said, the like Twitter, for example, is just so low resolution. I mean, for most people, that it just favors a very black and white dichotomy way of looking at things, just because of there's so much combinatorial explosion coming that people are impatient enough, or understandably, we just want to simplify things, which often leads to a left hemisphere way of doing things and can be addictive as well. There's those other issues with social media and so on.
yeah, exactly. You mentioned that maybe we would talk about this with Aaron whenever we all three to get together. But I've been thinking about it a lot, so I guess I'll just bring it up. In a lot of different literature that I've read, there seems to be this idea of, well, as we were talking about opponent processes, where there's two different systems with different moralities, almost different systems of value, like things that they're valuing, and they're kind of competing for resources, but they're kind of pushing back and forth against each other as they navigate reality together. And it seems to me that this is something that you see obviously with the left and right hemisphere. This is what you see with sort of the left and right of the political sphere, and you see this in men and women, I think. And actually, since at least 2016, and maybe earlier, it does seem like, I think I remember reading some like demographics about who's voting which way. It seems like men are more likely to vote red or Republican, and women are more likely to vote Democrat. And it almost does seem like there are these, and who was talking about how reality is like two different movie screens, where there's like the red screen and the blue screen, and like every event that happens is interpreted from a completely different lens.
Mm.
And the way I see that is it's interpreted from a different set of values. And so it seems like, yeah, it seems like reality has kind of bifurcated in two, or at least mainstream reality has bifurcated in two. But maybe that's how it should be. Maybe that's what the left and right hemisphere are for. Anyway, so I wanted to talk about men and women. Yeah, okay. Well, so it seems like that men and women have different value systems, or maybe I should say there's a masculine set of values and there's a feminine set of values. And masculinity seems to value strength and courage and mastery and uh, certainty, being a leader, leadership, things like that. And femininity is more being connected with reality and being sort of communion rather than agency. Have you read? Have you heard of integral theory from Ken Wilber?
Yes, very much.
Yeah. So how each holon has agency, but it also has communion. And so agency is I see it as kind of a more masculine thing. Like it's kind of individualism. It's like you're looking out for yourself, and you're trying to make your way in the universe and do things that are good for you. And then there's the communion aspect, which is where you're trying to do things that are good for your peers, basically your collective, and you're at the expense of your own well-being a lot of times. So I don't know. That's a lot of connections that I just made. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think to some extent that is correct, especially like with the bird using the right hemisphere eye to socialize, and then the left hemisphere eye to hunt, for example. I think you can map that to like evolutionary psychology to some extent. Um, and one counterpoint I'd make is that, I mean, with McGilchrist's model of like the right hemisphere being primary, I feel like in some sense they're somewhat orthogonal. Like he very briefly mentions, I think in the introduction or something, that there is some kind of stereotype that right hemisphere is more feminine, and then left hemisphere is more masculine. And then he says, if anything, it should be swapped, and then he never brings it up again. So it's hard to say what his argument is.
Yeah, he does that a few times where he cites everything really well except for a few places, and you're like, wait,
Yeah,
citation needed.
over the course of the book, my take was not so much either of those. It was more like the left hemisphere in isolation becomes kind of just mechanized and, in a sense, androgynous, even though it may superficially have some of the characteristics of masculinity, like agency and precision and certainty and so on. But that the actual gender expression, holistic gender expression would require the right hemisphere, because the right hemisphere is connected to the body for one, and like intuition and like instincts basically, whereas the left hemisphere is just a disembodied brain sort of thing where it's just more desexed in a sense. Even though some of the functions you could map to those fundamental masculine and feminine dichotomies, I feel like that's partially true, but then there's also that androgynous left hemisphere on its own because it's more specialized, whereas the right hemisphere, like I said, is more connected to like the roots of the body itself. He says like the body, art, and spirit or spirituality are the specialties of the right hemisphere that are lacking in a lot of like the left hemisphere dominant society.
Yeah, good point. I guess it makes sense that without femininity, there wouldn't be masculinity. As we talked about on our David Data episode, there needs to be polarity in order for there to be attraction. And I guess you could generalize that to there needs to be polarity in order for there to be gender. I mean, so if the left hemisphere is going nuts and rejecting the right hemisphere's existence and rejecting reality and just having the position that it's the only thing that exists, then that makes it androgynous because it then doesn't have any
Yes, exactly.
femininity to kind of
That's a good point.
assuming that it's masculine, any femininity to kind of balance, to kind of compare itself with. And so I guess in that way it would become androgynous. I think you could probably say the same thing about the right hemisphere or femininity without something more left hemisphere, without something more masculine, it becomes androgynous because yeah, there's nothing to compare it against.
Well, with the right hemisphere on its own, I feel like this would never, at least I assume it never happened with any organisms, but it would be able to like exist just kind of as a something that can avoid predation and survive, but it wouldn't really be able to go beyond that into systematizing things or like tool use or whatever. I'd be interested whether the brain hemisphere distinction or biological sex evolved first, actually, like encephalization. I feel like they happened fairly close together in evolutionary timeline. I feel like the brain might have evolved first, but I don't know if it had the left hemisphere distinction
Wait,
whatsoever
sorry,
early on.
which things are you saying you'd like to see if they evolved at the same time?
Uh,
Encephalization and what?
the brain, well, I'm pretty sure the brain evolved before male and female sex evolved. I might be wrong, but
Hmm.
I'd be curious whether the division between the left hemisphere and the right hemisphere evolved before um, biological sex and sexual reproduction.
Oh yeah, that's a really interesting idea.
I mean,
I'll have to look that
even
up.
though if one evolved first, it doesn't necessarily mean it's more fundamental now, but that might be interesting.
Um, yeah, that's a really interesting idea. But so I guess the inevitable comparison that has to be made is so if we're equating masculinity with the left hemisphere and we're equating the left hemisphere with predation, then is masculinity is there kind of a predatory aspect to it?
Yeah, I think for sure with like the hunting of forager cultures, it was almost exclusively done by men. And I think you can like there's a thing about males. I don't know how true it is. Viewing toward the same direction when they speak to each other because supposedly they were looking out for prey while on the hunt, whereas women tend to have more eye contact, which maps to like keeping eye contact with the infant while it's being held, whereas in males too much eye contact can be seen as like a threat or like rivalry, um, and that precise focus of like a single point, like watching for movement in the woods, hunting a deer or whatever, I think has been conserved evolutionarily, and is probably why first-person shooter games, for example, are more popular among males. And I think that is a left hemisphere trait, like focus very detailed on one thing.
Interesting. Yeah, no, I don't know if that's a masculine trait. It sounds like it very well might be. I definitely know that during a conversation, I find it hard to look people in the eye the whole time because um, it's distracting from thinking about what they're talking about. It's like I guess there's just a lot of information on a face, and so um, it's like like part of my working memory gets taken up by just the information being expressed through their face rather than the concepts that they're talking about.
Yeah, it's
So
almost like you have to choose. I've only recently tried kind of I guess maybe using the more right hemisphere thing of engaging with like what the emotional presence is, whereas before I was much more abstract and only paying attention to the words when I was younger.
hmm.
And it's almost like it's a trade-off relationship. Again, like you might forget some of the details of what they said, but you might get a better sense of where they're coming from on a more gestalt emotional level, which reminds me as well that the right hemisphere is I think even necessary for recognizing faces.
Hmm.
Like there was something where the left hemisphere people who had a right hemisphere stroke couldn't recognize their own children. I might be forgetting. There's a condition. I know a guy who has it where he can't even recognize his own children's faces in the crowd when he picks them up from school. It was just a genetic condition, not a stroke or anything.
Oh wow.
And
So I guess McGilchrist would probably say that's probably a right hemisphere deficiency. Like the left hemisphere is doing too much there, and the right hemisphere is doing not enough.
yeah, in his case, it was genetic, I believe. And then I think McGilchrist may have said that in some cases, if there's a right hemisphere stroke, that can also occur.
Hmm.
And that maps back to the masculine and feminine because women are known for being better at detecting faces, facial recognition, I believe. And yeah, that would lend more credence to the that mapping, because they're more social. Need to keep better track of social connections and so on with the facial recognition.
Interesting.
Right. So the facial recognition is something specialized in by the right hemisphere, and women also typically have better facial.
Oh yeah, yeah. Okay. So that's I I think we did talk about that earlier, where we were talking about how the left hemisphere has a model of what the face should look like, but the right hemisphere has this like spark of recognition type
Ah,
thing,
yes, yes.
where it recognizes the gestalt of somebody's face rather than simply the features. Um, I I I don't know if this really is I don't know if this is a weird transition, but I thought I thought it was so cool how those experiments where they could like selectively turn off somebody's hemisphere. So there's lots of different ways where you can. There's lots of different ways to emphasize one hemisphere or another. Some are genetic, some are like a stroke. But then there's this where you can do it in a lab. You can just like, I forget how they did it, but they just like injected somebody's brain, like left brain, with a chemical and just shut it off. And you could do the same thing with the right brain. Like you could just shut off one of the hemispheres and then it would just come back after an hour or two or something like that. I mean, that has to be, I feel like I want to try that at some point.
Yeah, I would definitely be curious. Like, I think he brought up the same experiments. These have stuck with me from, I think, first reading in Steven Pinker's Blank Slate book, The Myth of the Blank Slate, which we aren't, where they, I think it was normally done in patients who already had, I don't know if it was a stroke, but oh yeah, they needed surgery, so they actually cut their corpus callosum. So the hemispheres were acting more independently than
Mm-hmm.
normal. Um, and the left hemisphere is basically the verbal one, right? I guess we didn't emphasize this that much. But when speaking, it's like the left hemisphere that's being activated. In some sense, the right hemisphere is silent because even though he makes the interesting argument that language evolved first through music, which is more right hemisphere, of course, later when it was exapted, to use Vervaeke's term, for more like direct communication and like tool making procedural sort of stuff, the left hemisphere sort of took over. So the patient, when they're asked to describe it, it would be the left hemisphere that's being activated when they speak. And they were shown just image of, I think, the word like walk or stand up, the patient from their bed. So they stood up, and yeah, that's right. The image was only shown to their left eye, so their right hemisphere, and they stood up just instinctually. Um, and then they were asked why, and they would say because it's the left hemisphere that speaks, like, oh, I wanted to go get a drink or something.
Yeah.
And so the
Yeah.
left hemisphere is essentially like the self-justification system.
Yeah.
There's a lot of psychology on, like, I think you could kind of correlate that to the ego, where you make up stories about your behavior after the fact. Like that's the left hemisphere that does that.
Right. Yeah. It's like the rationalization center.
Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely, yeah, I've heard of experiments like that where they would show like a word to the right hemisphere, and the right hemisphere would, maybe it would be an instruction, as you said, like maybe it would say stand up. And so I guess the right hemisphere can see and recognize words, but it can't speak. It can like hear
Yes, I think
words.
so.
Yeah, but it can't speak. And so yeah, but it's funny when in those split brain experiments where yeah, the left hemisphere does that rationalization. It's like actually I was going to say exactly what you said, which is that that's the ego. It's like it has to tell a story about itself that's coherent. It can't just be like, I don't know why I did that. There has to be a reason
Yeah, and
for it.
that likely, I think this is Pinker who makes the case, but other evolutionary psychologists as well, that evolved in order to convince other people in the tribe that you're trustworthy, even though
Mm-hmm.
the instincts activated the behavior in the first place. Or like if you're planting seeds next to some other guy's wife and he comes over, and instinctually you were doing that because you want a chance to like get in bed with her, but then you say, oh, we're just planting seeds together, and then because culture had evolved for self-justification, I think this is Greg Henrique's example actually, who's been doing talks with Vervaeke, then the other person would, in theory, they can't argue with that really because you've given some kind of justification using the ego or the left hemisphere. Um, and that was like the origin of culture, he argues.
Mm.
There was another example, sort of in the opposite scenario, where someone was shown, I think, like choose from among these items in a box, and only their right hemisphere, so their left eye, was shown. Like say an eraser, and then their, what would it be? Yeah, their left hand is connected to the right hemisphere. Felt within the box and like held an eraser, but couldn't say anything about it, no matter, even though they were like squeezing it and trying to show that they had it, because the right hemisphere can't speak in those with the split, the surgery between the two hemispheres. About the ego, though, it reminded me also of, I think, like in Buddhism, the idea of the ego being an illusion, and like the book Vervaeke recommends, Religion and Nothingness, talks about how Descartes' Cogito was a kind of doubling of awareness, looking back on itself via language. That I think, therefore I am,
Mm-hmm.
and that there's something more fundamental than that, which is the awareness itself, which you could map to something that's more like the right hemisphere. But because the left hemisphere represents itself to itself, it kind of kickstarted that kind of mind-body split, like Descartes' metaphysics almost were like the left hemisphere recognizing itself in a more fundamental way.
Right. Yeah. So McGilchrist brings up Descartes and he talks about how, oh, isn't this ridiculous? This is something that the left hemisphere would say. I think, therefore I am, like, and postulate that the people outside his window are merely mindless automatons
Yeah.
instead of people with minds and souls. So that thing that you said about how there's something deeper, like actual reality, that's something that I guess is only really present to the right hemisphere.
Yeah, so like the left hemisphere, just it'll never be convinced of it through words. I mean, it can be, rationally convinced, but you won't get the visceral sense of it without the right hemisphere having some kind of experience. Yeah.
Right, exactly. And so like when you, for me, like I've and you can go back on Multiversity Project and see our arguments about whether Descartes is right and how so whether anything is really true. I think our first episode was about that, maybe the second one. And I'm definitely torn between, like, whenever I argue it, whenever I talk about it with people, I'm like, well, reality may or may not exist, and so what can we really know? But then but I also have this, well, and so what I say is yeah, if you want to boil down reality to what it is at its core, you really can't know anything unless you, I think this is where faith comes from, right? Like you just kind of axioms of your system upon which everything else is built are assumed to be true. And so it's like you can take your feelings about reality, that sort of gut sense that something is real, and you can take, because it originates in the right hemisphere, right? And you can take that and you can import it into your system, into your left hemisphere, as an axiom,
Mm,
and then you can
right.
start proving all these things in your left hemisphere. But but you can't logically prove the axioms of the system. This is one of the things that Gödel's incompleteness theorem was talking about.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can't prove the axioms of the system from within the system. So the axioms have to come from somewhere else.
Yeah,
And
exactly.
so,
I think that
yeah,
very
it's like,
much is talking about the presencing being the origin of the axiom.
right, yeah.
Yeah, that's good. I kind of take Donald Hoffman's view of reality as just mediated through our perceptions, which are shaped by natural selection for fitness rather than precision, which is kind of subordinate to fitness. Um, but yeah, like there's something, but the
Yeah,
left.
that was the guy that was talking about what really is reality, and how yeah, how consciousness is not necessarily a model of reality, but it's a model that will cause us to behave in a way that's um, that'll cause us to survive
Yeah,
with
yeah.
some regularity.
Where you take things seriously, but not literally, because they may well not. And
I
the
like
question
that.
of whether,
Seriously, but not literally.
yeah, which I kind of like. I think Buddhism is getting at similar things, um, where like a train may not look like that whatsoever, even though you still want to step out of the way because your model of reality works enough that you know that that's not, you know enough that that's not going to be good for your fitness. And then the question of whether there is some objective train is, um, like Leibniz positing the God's eye view of everything, which is something we don't have access to anyway. Which I think comes back to the right hemisphere being essential for being comfortable with ambiguity versus people who are kind of in the left hemisphere possessed mode, just jumping to some sort of certainty, some sort of conclusion, which just locks them into potentially some kind of ideology or dogma. Whereas the right hemisphere is always partially open because they know that reality is beyond their representation of it. And I feel like that's possibly the core message I feel like needs to kind of be spread, that this book makes a really good case for, is especially in our time of, because there's so much information that people just want to lock into some kind of framework that gives them that sense of security to the left hemisphere. um, yeah.
Well, wait, sorry. So what's that last thing that you said? The sense of security in the left hemisphere. Doesn't the sense of security come from the right hemisphere though?
Well, the left hemisphere like wants some kind of uh, specific model, and like the left hemisphere views things, the black and white with certainty, right? It's not
Oh,
comfortable
I
with
see what you're saying. So
ambiguity.
yeah, the left hemisphere is responsible for yeah, basically worrying about security. Sure. Although I guess the right hemisphere is looking out for predators or whatever.
Yeah,
So
so it's like the left hemisphere would look for some kind of framework that explains everything, and then once they find it, they feel like, okay, this explains everything, and they'll feel secure. Whereas, and then other potential frameworks they'll view as a threat. Whereas the right hemisphere is constantly looking out for other ways of viewing the world. Like he does the thing where the left hand is like exploratory. Like if you put people in some kind of, I don't know, half conscious state, I forget the brain state they're in. Um, whereas the right hand, the left hemisphere, will grasp at things when
mhm.
people are partly conscious, which relates, I think, to like the instrumentalization and tool use aspect of the left hemisphere versus the exploratory open nature of the right hemisphere.
Yeah. So yeah, I like that. And going back a little bit earlier when you were talking about um, how we see what we need to see and not necessarily what is there. I think it was Vervaeke talking, maybe somebody else, but talking about how um, you see the significance of things to you and not what is actually there. And this connects with what McGilchrist was saying about how, there's too much information. So the right hemisphere filters out some of it, and then the left hemisphere filters out most of that. Um, and so, yeah, you end up actually seeing only the things that actually matter to you, or what you think actually matter to you. And so I think it was Vervaeke who talks about, um, babies when they approach, they crawl towards, a cliff or something like that, or a what is it, like if you put a sheet of plexiglass, between two solid surfaces, and you have the baby crawl into it, they won't, because they sense like a falling off place.
Yes,
And so
affordances.
affordances, yeah, exactly. So yeah, you don't see a cliff, you see a falling off place. Like if I and so it's a type of knowledge that goes much deeper than knowing what it is. It's knowing, like in your bones, how you're going to react to being near it.
Yeah, I feel like that could be mapped partially to Vervaeke's participatory knowledge. Like the left hemisphere, I was going to say this earlier, the left hemisphere is clearly propositional knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Words, like it specializes in language. And then I think procedural is also mostly left hemisphere, like the grasping and the tool use, knowing how to do something. But
Hmm.
there's some right hemisphere in that as well because it connects to the body. And then I think the perspectival and the participatory are both very much right hemisphere, like they're more fundamental. But when people, get locked into just like language games or just always online, it can feel like that, like those are just forgotten, and the propositional just creates feedback loops for creating the salience landscape that the left hemisphere has already modeled and therefore it's comfortable with, and then like social media algorithms just giving them more of the same, so it feels like that is reality.
Right. Yeah. So I before we go, I'd love to talk about how there, so the second part of the book is all about how McGilchrist thinks that um, the balance between the left and the right hemisphere has changed over the course of history. So we alluded to this earlier when we were talking about how you could view the Democrats and the Republicans as more left here, more left hemisphere and more right hemisphere. Um, and so basically, yeah, you can take the two hemispheres in an individual mind, but you can map that onto society as a whole, or really onto any organization of people. Um, and so like I guess the upshot of all that is that right now he thinks that um, this sort of postmodern movement and the religion of science and all of this is indicative that that the left hemisphere has become hyper dominant
Yep.
in our society, and he sees that as a big problem.
Yeah, I largely agree with his take on that. I mean, I think the book makes a pretty convincing case. I found it fascinating how he goes through history where, like, I think he starts basically in the Middle Ages where there was, you may have said there's some kind of balance there. I forget. But then the Renaissance he thought was like a, he's very pro Renaissance. It was like a perfect integration of the two. And then the Reformation, he argues, was initially a desire for authenticity, which he also connects to the right hemisphere. But then it became more left hemisphere dominant when it had to, base its theology on just like the text itself of the Bible as opposed to any kind of group of people. And then he's also rather critical of the Enlightenment, seeing that as like hyper left hemisphere dominance, and then very pro romanticism as like the resurgence of the right hemisphere in compensation. It's kind of like Hegel's theory of history, like I know this wasn't Hegel's idea, but the stereotype of the thesis, antithesis, synthesis, where it's going back and forth. But he sees that each time the left hemisphere is a little bit more dominant and the right hemisphere is a little bit more suppressed. So he has a rather pessimistic view of the proper balance or integration going forward. And I feel like the movements right now, like Integral is a great example of trying to integrate the two, religion and science. I feel like that in some ways is still kind of the task of our time. And Vervaeke's project, I think, is brilliant in that regard.
Right, the religion that isn't a religion.
Yeah, which I know the main critique of it from like the more traditionalists is that it lacks a narrative. But I mean, part of the point is that it's a framework for communication that can go between narratives and before narratives, since a narrative is already within a given frame. Um, yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. Do you see the I I don't remember reading it, but you put it really well that every time the dialectic experiences a cycle, it seems like the left hemisphere comes out a little bit more dominant than before. Yeah, I don't remember Miguel Chris saying that, but that certainly seems true, and it almost strikes me as what happens to a human as it goes from being a child to an adult. I mean, you start out in life, you're very uncertain, you're experiencing very very viscerally kind of all of reality, and there's all this information and you're not really sure which things to pay attention to, and so you're probably using your right hemisphere a lot.
Mm.
You can't speak, you're probably not really using your left hemisphere at all. It almost seems like the process of maturation for a human being is is a process of development of the left hemisphere, basically developing habits that map onto your reality, that allow you to ignore large parts of the information that's coming in. And so it's kind of like, yeah, it's kind of like, I feel like the process of maturation is that process of accelerating through the universe, by like forming these habits and these
Frameworks.
these frameworks that work.
Yep.
So I don't know, I didn't think of that until I just heard you say that, but maybe humanity is just becoming an adult or something, or is becoming mature or something like that, and maybe it's in its teenage years or something like that. I don't know.
Yeah, that would align with like the techno utopia type vision, perhaps. Like humanity waking up to itself because the left hemisphere is aware of itself. I'd love to hear you make that argument to McGilchrist, though. I wonder what he'd say. I think there's
Yeah,
something.
I'd love to have him on at some point.
Yeah, same. I think there is something to it, but I feel like the right hemisphere he views as just being overly ignored or forgotten, and in a sense, like coming back as a shadow in the form of I would argue like conspiracy theories or fundamentalism and compensation in unhealthy ways. Whereas when the environment is changing, like you need the openness of the right hemisphere to update your framework. That's the thing, and I feel like we are in a liminal phase right now where the right hemisphere needs to be able to form new gestalts so that we can build new frameworks. Like I'm quite partial to Alexander Bard's thesis on the internet as like not the equivalent, but even more fundamental a change than the printing press, where he argued that led to like the French Revolution and democracy and so on. And now we're just starting to feel the early rumblings of that kind of transition again with the internet. And for that reason, I feel like we need the right hemisphere to be open to like entirely new presencings rather than relying on the old, modernist frameworks, which I feel like the Blue Church, Jordan Halls, is still very much reliant upon.
Yeah. I see a lot of similarities between that and so McGilchrist's argument that we need more influence from the right hemisphere is I mean, that could be true or it could not be true. It could be that we're gathering momentum and what we're doing is working, and so we're able to go kind of faster and faster and faster. And so when you're first I don't know, when you're first learning how to do something like drive a car or ride a bicycle or something like that, and you kind of figure it out, right? And you figure out how to go fast without falling or something like that. Then there's a while where you're like in the liminal space where you're like, am I going too fast? Is this dangerous? Because you haven't crashed yet, so you don't really know whether you can just keep going faster or whether you're entering a dangerous space until you actually do crash, or you have some kind of scary enough experience that you have to change. And Jordan Peterson talks about this a lot, where the moment where your model breaks, right? You have some experience that throws your whole model into chaos because it was wrong. And so, like, I see the world like that right now. I mean, basically, nothing bad enough has happened that people are gonna
Wake up to it.
yeah, they're gonna be motivated
Yeah.
to actually change how they do stuff because they're so used to doing things how they've been doing them and they're basically working. World War II was an example of a shattering of the Gestalt. It was like, okay, let's make sure that doesn't happen again. But we haven't. I don't think we've really had anything like that since World War II. That was kind of the last time where everything fell apart.
Yeah.
And I hate to say this, but I think such events are necessary in order for growth to occur. So, as yeah, I mean, maybe, yeah, maybe something bad should happen, or maybe it shouldn't, maybe we're on the right track, but I think it's unlikely that we'll see a resurgence of the right hemisphere without some kind of very, very unexpected and impactful event.
Yeah, I think the best thing to do is kind of to build um, different sectors or communities, or I mean, ideally institutions, but that's much harder, that are more prepared to weather the transition into completely different models of society, so that when such a disaster does happen and then people en masse and institutions en masse are motivated to change, that there's already, like frameworks that have started being built, even if at a small scale, that they can more helpfully or easily transition into. Um, yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I totally agree. At the same time, our institutions are, I mean, they're doing a terrible job. They could be doing a much better job, but everything hasn't fallen apart yet. Like this pandemic hit, and a lot of people obviously have criticized the response from governments. Uh, but there does seem to be a lot more unrest than there was. But basically, stuff is still working, and like this isn't like a Great Depression or like
hmm
World War II event yet. I mean, I guess
yeah,
it
yeah,
could always get worse. But uh, reality seems very stable right now, and you know, again, there are lots of potential things that could go wrong, but it seems like our institutions are basically staving off disaster for now.
yeah.
So
Jordan Hall is always talking about how he's like they're compensating at perhaps the economic level by drawing on the social level, and kind of sacrificing the trust in institutions, for example, like offloading weight from one sector of society to another, not even sector, but like different paradigm. And that at some point, when one snaps, it's like the whole chain is going to snap. And he's constantly saying like, oh, he doesn't say this, but I feel like he's saying like anytime now, anytime now. So I'm always
yeah,
like watching what he's doing, what he's predicting, because I feel like he's still kind of my go-to person for like what's coming next.
yeah. Well, you can you can go back to any point in history and find smart people like that who are constantly warning of impending disaster. And you know, like the libertarians, for instance, the Austrian economists have always been talking about like, well, we're printing all this money. There's going to be hyperinflation. The whole world is going to collapse under the weight of its own debt. And it's like it certainly seemed like that was unsustainable. Like 40 years ago when they started talking about it. But somehow, they keep just hacking the system in order to continue creating more money, and somehow the system. I mean, okay, so there was the 2008 financial crisis, and it seems like the lessons that should have been learned from that were not learned. Um, and so it definitely seems like Jordan Hall is right, and that like anytime now.
Yeah, yeah,
um, and I guess you could also make the argument that like maybe we are in the collapse. Maybe this is it. Maybe we've been in it since 2008, and
mm,
Trump getting elected, and this pandemic thing is they're all just the very slow train wreck of Western civilization.
right, right. Like the
uh,
collapse of the Roman Empire, there wasn't like a single event that defined it exactly.
right, exactly. Yeah.
There was one more thing I wanted to bring up, which is an idea I had on how like Carl Jung's idea of the shadows could perhaps be explained in terms of the hemispheres, where things that are known in the right hemisphere but rejected and repressed by the left hemisphere because it doesn't fit its model that it prefers using right now,
Mm-hmm.
is kind of haunted by the nonverbal right hemisphere's attempts to integrate, perhaps with images or just like visceral reactions when you see something that doesn't fit your model of the left hemisphere, because you want to like just avoid that thing because
Mm-hmm.
you want to focus on what does fit your model, um, and therefore treat it as like bad or evil or wrong. But
Mm-hmm.
as long as an integration is resisted, like McGilchrist calls it the Aufhebung, the German word Hegel used, instead of synthesis, that the shadow like eats away at the conscious mind, which exerts more and more resources to fight the right hemisphere and like avoid all the different shadows or gestalts that don't fit the current left hemisphere framework model, until at some point, like there's so many gestalts that don't integrate that there's some kind of breakdown of the left hemisphere framework and you have to rebuild it, um, as opposed to having like straw men of all the different gestalt models that you can easily knock over, which kind of conceals like this large framework beneath them that you just haven't been willing to look at yet.
Yeah. Um, yeah, that's definitely something that I've been thinking about for the last couple of years. Is like, I guess, I mean, I don't know if there's much that I can add to that. Yeah, I think you were spot on with that. It definitely seems like, so the right hemisphere, seeing as it's more plugged into reality, it's probably more plugged into the reality of who you are and what you are. And the left hemisphere, seeing as it's connected to the ego and this kind of narrative that you tell yourself about who you are, the shadow under that model would be anything that doesn't fit the narrative,
Yeah.
as you said. And so the process of individuation, of integrating the shadow, would be a process of the left hemisphere understanding the right hemisphere more and more over time, which I guess, as I was saying earlier, would require sort of surprising events.
Yeah, some kind of breakdown of the model would be necessary to make room because, like you said about Godel, like if it's completely coherent, then it's not complete. So it needs to be restructured, if there's new information.
Yeah, exactly.
Um, there's one more point, unless you want to bring up something on that, I forgot. Uh, where like the being mode, I think you could map Vervaeke's terms to the right hemisphere. And then also the idea of McGilchrist talks about longing, like the kind of joy of yearning for something that you don't have, versus the left hemisphere being more like the having mode. And then like what Buddhists talk about is craving, where it's more the dopamine function, where there's a need, like an addictive need for something, and you feel negatively because you don't have it. Whereas the right hemisphere is more like the he talks about the minstrels in the Middle Ages composing ballads to like a royal lover that they could never have, but in the very act of not having that thing, they still kind of enjoy that reverberation of this distant object of yearning, which kind of reminded me of something Ariel had said about the episode you guys did on the whether you have a voice in your head talking to yourself, which I think there's probably a lot to connect to that with the
Yeah.
left hemisphere as well, where
Well, I
she,
mean, everything connects. That was a shorter one. We did a live stream on that. We didn't do a full episode, but it was one of our more popular live streams, though. Yeah.
yeah, I enjoyed that one, where she talked about like the richness or the bittersweetness of musing on like what could have been, like how sadness is the most beautiful emotion. It's very much a right hemisphere perspective, that longing type relation to something that you don't have, versus the left hemisphere, like addictively trying to get it, which might be more instrumental. Like it actually is more efficient at getting things, but
Yeah, it could be. Yeah, I think you could also just call that a difference between wanting and needing something, where the left hemisphere is more needing, and the right hemisphere is more wanting.
like a melancholic way also.
Yeah, where you just have kind of that was yeah, it's very beautiful how you put that. And Ariel always does say sadness is the most beautiful emotion. Um, yeah, yeah, I would. Again, I don't know if I have much to add to that. Yeah, that's what were you saying about the voice, the narrative in your head? How does that connect?
Oh yeah, I should have written this one down. But so how most people have a narrative going throughout the day, saying
Right.
things. I think I actually posted it in the comments of that video. I noticed, like, I definitely went through a period of like a ton of studying and finishing my degree where I was much more in the left hemisphere mode, of like constantly writing notes and underlining things. Like I know I mentioned before this, how I do that with nonfiction books ever since then. and eventually had some kind of breakpoint when like the what you could probably call shadow work, or integrated my right hemisphere more again. And during that time, I absolutely had a constant narrative, which was just like kind of annoying, really, going throughout the day. Whereas my normal state of being throughout most of my early youth, and now more so again, it's a little more image based, and the words are just only used in preparation for things, or just like I is not a constant stream of talking, which could be helpful if you're like writing everything down, which I was constantly writing notes about my own voice or psychology, but I think that can
You're
kind of
saying
get
so.
back
You're
to that.
saying the writing helped you kind of get the words out of your head and resulted in having fewer narratives in your head, or was it correlated together where like the more you wrote stuff down, the more of a narrative you had?
It was probably somewhat correlated, but I still think it was helpful in the long run to be able to reflect on them later. But yeah, it's almost like I think most people have that narrative, or
Mm-hmm.
the statistics. They have a constant voice in their head speaking to them. But I wonder whether different, kinds of society encourages that more. Like more literate society obviously would, but like McCokus talks about schizophrenics having more of that constant stream of voice, or other voices that they don't recognize, which you could argue
Right.
right hemisphere in their head.
Yeah, which could be, when we were talking, when we did that episode, um, the people who had narratives were saying that I was like, is it your voice? And they were like, well, it's yes, kind of.
Mhm.
So I could see how you could see it as kind of a disembodied voice, or maybe the voice of God or something like that. Oh, there's a book that people keep recommending to me about this, about how this narrative may have been why people believed in God, because I don't remember what the book is called.
Is it Julian Jaynes' Origin of the Bicameral Mind and the Breakdown of
Yes,
Consciousness?
yes, it is.
I
Thank
recommend it.
you. um, so yeah, but the crazy thing is that I've never had a narrative. I don't I don't get that at all. I don't know. Um, I mean, this is another whole topic that we could get into. Like why do some people have that and other people don't? Like, are the people who have the narrative more left brain? I have noticed that the people who have it maybe seem to be a bit more like on edge or stressed out. I mean,
Mhm.
like, were you at all like stressed out when you had the
Yeah,
narrative at that
yeah,
point in
for
your life?
sure. I think that's a correlation. But
So
are you
yeah,
able to, if you want to like practice a sentence before you speak it, do that? It's just not automatic.
what was the question?
Are you like able to have the narrative before you say a sentence out loud, for example? It's just not automatic.
Um, no, I mean, I can't practice a sentence before saying it. No, I mean, I can practice like saying maybe like 10 words in a row, but I can't like when I'm doing this, when I'm just describing what's on my mind, there's a little chain of logic that I'm going, okay, and I'm explaining this in words, and then I'm explaining this in words, and then I'm explaining this in words, and I'm just kind of following the chain until I get to the end. But it doesn't appear as words in my brain until I
Right,
speak them.
right.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I'd be definitely interested to see what McGilchrist would say about that, or if he's done any research on it. It definitely seems related to me.
Let's see if I can remember. Oh, I was gonna say, so I actually always have music playing in my mind.
Always?
um, Not always, but a lot of times. And the more like stimulants I'm on, the more like caffeine or whatever that I'm on, and like the more like on a roll I am, the more there will just be like a soundtrack that just doesn't stop. Sometimes it'll be like the same song that's just on for the whole day.
So you would have words, it would just be only a lyrics, for example.
Right, but there isn't an emphasis on the words.
Okay.
Although, um, yeah, I guess sometimes there's words, but a lot of times there aren't words. A lot of times there's just rhythms or uh, chords, things like that, or melodies.
Yeah, but
So it goes back to what McGilchrist was saying about how language originated as music or whatever.
yeah, he's extremely pro music. He'd probably be happy to hear that you have that.
Yeah.
But yeah, the Origin of Consciousness book by Julian Jaynes, I highly recommended. I read it right before this book, and they were like a perfect pairing
Okay.
because you could easily map. And McGilchrist actually talks about it briefly. He basically agrees with Jaynes' thesis, but then just switches the hemispheres, if I remember correctly, um, or something. Where Jaynes
Yeah.
argues that in pre-modern times, before written language, or was it when we first had the beginning of written language, what were previously the voices of the gods, which could be construed as like the right hemisphere, um, kind of giving messages to the left hemisphere, and then the left hemisphere didn't view it as the self narrative. They viewed it as something else, yeah, like God, just not their own mind. And then eventually, through language, people recognized that it was their own, mind, and then the voices of the gods, which were in like priests or priestesses, like the oracle at Delphi, eventually were not able to hear those messages from the unconscious as much over time. It's really, really fascinating book. I recommend it.
Interesting. Yeah. Well, that's interesting that you say the messages from the unconscious, because the way I see things, the right hemisphere is um, more linked to the unconscious, and
Yeah,
it doesn't really speak. So
yeah, that's the weird thing because you would think the words would have to be from the left hemisphere. Like,
unless McGilchrist would say, unless it's like poetic in some way, unless it's like poetry, because the right hemisphere writes poetry and understands poetry.
yeah,
So if it's like if there's like deep layers of meaning that aren't necessarily following some kind of logical process, then the right hemisphere is down with that.
yeah, I think that could be construed as the what it mostly was doing. And I
And
think
I think that when you look at religious texts and mythology and things, usually it's like that. Usually it's like
yeah, that's what I was going to say.
symbols and yeah,
Exactly.
things that don't necessarily it's not all like the Ten Commandments, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he actually talks about he has a whole chapter on the Hebrews as like a new kind of consciousness that's more linguistic, if I remember correctly. Because yeah, they were the first ones to like emphasize the text so much. I'm forgetting things now. I read that one before this one. Yeah, it was pretty much most of my notes. This was great though.
Cool. Yeah. Yeah, I was thinking maybe we should wrap things up. I mean, we I'm sure I could keep going for hours and hours, but yeah, I got some other stuff to take care of today. But
Sounds good.
yeah, let's definitely do this again.
Yeah, I very much enjoyed it.
There's a lot of I mean, there's so many tangents that I wanted to go on that I didn't get to go on. So I guess we'll.
Yeah, did you get through your 6 notes, your 6 sentences?
Oh well, I said art, music, poetry, categorization destroys the ineffable, language, opponent processing. Those are my 6 notes. So
Yeah,
yes, I think we did actually hit all of those.
yeah. The
Um,
categorization destroys the ineffable is something I wrote this essay about. I could go into that for like a whole nother discussion probably.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, we touched on it. It's kind of like it's why I see postmodernism and critical theory as like this philosophical solvent.
Mhm.
It's like you can apply it to really any idea and just dissolve
Yeah.
it. Thanks for joining us, everyone. Tune in next time for Conversations with Connor. Conversations with Chris.
Oh yeah. Conversations with Chris and Connor. But yeah, good talking to you, Chris. It was really great after watching all your stuff.